All right, what an exciting night of fights tonight. Let's mic check real quick, and then we're gonna get right into it. Mic check 1, 2. Canelo looked human, but at the same time, you could think that maybe that's just a factor of the fact that John Ryder is a tough competitor. Aljo won, but a lot of people are kind of skeptical about that. And then you got to think, what are the new criterias that they have in the sport today in terms of how they're going to score and how they're going to take takedowns as opposed to leg kicks. And then Sean O'Malley came in there and basically started a whole bunch of stuff. So let us see. So a little mic check before we get going. See. So a little mic. All right, so the mic check is perfect. So we just now witnessed UFC 288 in the books, and then Canelo versus John Ryder in the books. And what do we got to say about these two fights? Well, I always said that if Canelo and Henry Cejudo were to lose tonight, it would be very bad for Mexican combat sports. But tonight, you had one out of the two. And what does that really say about MMA as opposed to boxing? Well, a couple of things. For one of the things that you could take out of that is taking into consideration the fact that in MMA, it's an extremely unpredictable sport. It's unpredictable in its outcomes. It's unpredictable in the way that it comes about in terms of how the action comes into play, how random knockouts and submissions come out of nowhere, as opposed to boxing where you have a mechanism of a controlled environment. Not only that, a type of sport that literally needs and requires a certain level of skill and repetition in order for you to win. And then the guy who has done all those years of repetition is usually the guy that's going to come out on top and the guy that's going to come out to win, which is exactly what you have going on with Canelo going on tonight. Okay, you had a guy here who is everything that you know him to be. A great puncher, a methodical head mover, and not only that, somebody that has evolved his skills ever since he fought Floyd Mayweather, and then even you could say has evolved even after the Bivol loss. Now, I see a lot of people say things about Canelo, saying something to the effect where, okay, you know what, this guy is not really the same guy as he was anymore. Now, is that the case, or is it just the fact that John Ryder is just a tough competitor in the way that he is? You could say that about Henry Cejudo as well, right? Because then you could say, well, you know what? Was Henry Cejudo really the guy that he says he was going to be coming into this fight? Or is it just the simple fact that he was in here with somebody like Aljo, who is a methodical fighter, somebody that has come a long way in terms of the type of camp that he's got going on with Ray Longo? I mean, you look at all the guys that are in his camp earlier in the night. You had Matt Favola defeating Drew Dober, which I think was a pretty big upset, knocking him out and finishing him on the ground the way that he did. I think that a lot of the guys in the Ray Longo camp are just really coming up in terms of just being a cohesive team, in terms of having the experience that they have over the years with the likes of Matt Serra, Al Iaquinta, and then you had Chris Weidman with his famous Anderson Silva fights and his championship run that he's had along the way on top of that. And then you have Merab, who is one of the top guys in the division right now. But once again, it kind of creates this whole aspect of, well, where is this fight and this division going to be when you have somebody like Merab, who's a number 2 guy, and then Aljo, who is the champion? And how are they going to settle that? Are you going to have to wait until Merab Aljo loses to somebody, and then Merab comes and steps in and avenges the loss of Aljo? Or eventually, are they just going to break and crack, and one of those guys goes and moves to a different team, and eventually ends up fighting in the way that Rashad Evans and John Jones did. Well, who knows, right? Because, tonight you had Sean O'Malley come into the cage and basically got into the face of Aljamain Sterling. And then not only that, he went and took the red jacket of Sean O'Malley, and right after he took his jacket, they got into it right in the cage, to which the security had to come in and break everything up. So then you have that situation going on. If, let's say, Sean O'Malley happens to defeat Aljamain Sterling, because you got to think, why not, right? It seems like he's the perfect tailored match for Sean O'Malley. I'm talking about Aljamain Sterling, because let's face it, right? Sean O'Malley is a great striker, maybe an even better striker, maybe perhaps an even better boxer than Aljamain Sterling. As opposed to if he was to take on Henry Cejudo, he might have just been taken down quite a few times to the point where he wouldn't be able to get up or wouldn't be able to get used to that kind of skills in wrestling. As opposed to now Sean O'Malley fighting the likes of Aljamain Sterling, who is what you could say is somebody who may be equal to his wrestling or maybe superior in the striking aspect in terms of the boxing and in terms of the footwork that Sean O'Malley can present to Aljamain Sterling. But nonetheless, if let's say Sean O'Malley was to win, guess what? Now Merab has a chance and a built-in storyline to go in there and fight Sean O'Malley based on this little beef they had going on tonight. So, a little bit of the boxing side with Canelo and Ryder. Now, not a bad showing for Ryder, right? Because he made Canelo look human. And then some will argue that maybe perhaps Canelo made himself look human because he's just getting old, or because of the fact that he's in this situation where he's just not the same guy as he was anymore. Or maybe it's just one of those situations where John Ryder just really came and brought the fight of his life. Nonetheless, John Ryder comes out of this situation a millionaire, paid, not having to work or worry about finances for the rest of his life, because guess what? Canelo is a big payday in boxing. And then made a great account of himself. Now, with Henry Cejudo losing tonight, that's a little bit different. You see, Henry Cejudo has already made a lot of money in the fight game. He's already had gold medals. He's already been a double champion. And him losing tonight, it's not about like, okay, well, I came in here and made money in the same way that John Ryder did tonight. It's more like I came in here to win sports glory. In terms of being out for 3 years and then all of a sudden you had to come back and get this title that you've vacated, and only for Aljamain Sterling to hold it and defend it quite a few times in the way that he did. And by the way, a lot of those in lackluster terms, right? Because like what I've mentioned before, you guys know about when he won the title against Peter Yan, but prior to that, he won the title in a very lackluster way, or in a very suspect way, by disqualification. And then was made a mockery of as a champion, and then had to prove himself. But now defeating somebody like Henry Cejudo, it's almost like you can't deny the guy anymore. You can't call him that fake actor. You can't call him that guy that faked his way into a disqualification win or had a lackluster win against Peter Yan. Now you could say that he's a real champion, maybe somebody that you can market in terms of the fan base that, let's say, the UFC is yearning for, in terms of the urban audience, in terms of the African American market in MMA that has always been a big factor in boxing. Now you have that with Aljamain Sterling, and then on top of the fact that he has a dance partner now like Sean O'Malley with a compelling storyline, that if Sean O'Malley was to go out and win this fight, guess what? You got a situation where now he can go take on his teammate like Merab, who's very well deserving of this title shot, but is not able to get it because of the fact that his training partner, Aljamain Sterling, is a champion. Now, in the other fights of the card, how about Bilal Muhammad, right? I'm going to go back and forth with all these fights. I'm not going to stop talking about Henry Cejudo and Aljamain Sterling moving forward, right? But let's just talk about all these fights not in a particular order, but let's cover all of them, right? First off, you had Movsar Evloev getting a decision win over Diego Lopez. Kron Gracie, on the other hand, opening the card of the night against Charles Jourdain, pulling guard, constantly trying to be on his back in terms of trying to gain some kind of submission leverage or some kind of positioning to where he's going to get a submission off of his back. Very old school in the way that they described it, right? Very Royce Gracie-like, and again, he's related to the guy, so why wouldn't he fight that way? But once again, this kind of goes into the criticism that Anderson Silva has had about the Gracie family for a long time, which is what? The fact that the Gracie family just never really cared about evolving themselves in terms of being well-rounded martial artists. Now, why is that? Well, the reason why they never really tried to evolve themselves is because they just trusted so much in jiu-jitsu in terms of not evolving their striking, in terms of not evolving their footwork, in terms of not evolving their kicks, their punches, their clinches, and their knees with the clinches that mixes in with the Muay Thai, and then the wrestling aspect of controlling the guy from a top position, which you saw Kron Gracie do none of. He just wanted to pull guard in a constant motion of this fight and hopes that he could somehow catch Charles Jourdain slipping. Well, Charles Jourdain is a little bit of a well-rounded fighter. I mean, the guy is a former TKO champion up in Canada. He's had different types of skill sets over the years of his development in mixed martial arts, and it showed in that fight. So it's a little bit surprising that Kron Gracie went into this fight very unprepared, but at the same time, he came in here in terms of really sticking with his style and being true to the art form of jiu-jitsu. Now, you got to think, is that the most effective way of going about things? Maybe not. And then you had Jessica Andrade getting knocked out by Yan, the Chinese fighter, in the first round, now becoming a number one contender to Wei Li Zhang, having a Chinese-on-Chinese strawweight women's title fight in the future, which, by the way, is very big for the Chinese market, in which the UFC is really trying to get their hands on. And then you had Belal Muhammad tonight coming off of Ramadan, getting a 5-round decision. And by the way, some things that I have noticed about this fight was that Belal Muhammad did have some kind of injury in his leg, but was able to utilize his stance switches to sort of hide it. But then in the midst of that, while he was hiding these stance switches, what does Belal Muhammad do? He goes and aims right directly towards Gilbert Burns' arms and his hands, which eventually broke his arm or his hand, I think, to where it gave him an advantage throughout the fight. Now, he wasn't the heaviest puncher in this particular fight, but Belal Muhammad showed what he could do with his kicks, and on top of that, what he was able to do with his takedown defense. He got taken down one time, but got back up. I think he was able to get a few takedowns on Gilbert Burns. Let's see the stats on this one. What was the stats? There was really no takedowns from any of them, actually. 4 out of the attempts by Gilbert Burns was all failed, including the one that he had in the first round where basically Belal Muhammad was able to get right back up. So it wasn't really a takedown or a success at that matter. And then you had Canelo tonight. I mean, what can you really say about Canelo? It's just another night in boxing, right? But then back to the UFC now, right? There wasn't really much to say about that. I mean, look, the card was not really that big in terms of the undercard that they were building. I mean, does anybody really know any of the fighters that was in the undercard of Canelo and Ryder? I mean, maybe the hardcore Mexican boxing fan base knew who they were, but in terms of just like general fandom, I don't think a lot of people knew who the people were in that undercard. But then the UFC, on the other hand, you had a situation where you had Kron Gracie taking on Charles Jourdain. You had Movsar Evloev taking off Diego Lopez, who made a great account of himself. Then you had Jessica Andrade getting knocked out by Yan. And then you had Belal Muhammad taking a 5-round decision against Gilbert Burns after Gilbert Burns just came from a Jorge Masvidal fight a couple of weeks ago, while Jorge Masvidal has all these things going on in the news cycle with his dad getting attempted murder charges for whatever reason or whatever beef he had going on in Miami. I mean, that is what's going on in the world of mixed martial arts in comparison to boxing. And then on the early prelims, you had, Joseph Holmes taking on Claudio Ribeiro, and then Claudio Ribeiro gets a second round TKO knockout, and then Phil Hawes gets knocked out by Ikram Ali Askarov, who, by the way, was a former opponent of Khamzat Chimaev, and Khamzat Chimaev said that this is one of the toughest fights that he's ever had in his career. And by the way, Phil Hawes was doing a very good job early in the fight, getting those body kicks in the same similar fashion that Bilal Muhammad was doing tonight. But then just out of nowhere, Ikram was able to knock him out in the fashion that he did 2 minutes into the first round. And then you had Parter Porter taking on Braxton Smith, getting a first-round knockout himself. By the way, the same time frame that Ikram got the knockout as well. First round, 2 minutes and 10 seconds for Parter Porter. And then you had Ikram, who had a first-round knockout, 2 minutes and 10 seconds, the same exact time that they both got a knockout, back-to-back fights. Right, it was great. Braxton and Smith and Parker were throwing bombs at each other, and then Parker was able to hit the bomb on him, and then just out of nowhere was able to ground and pound him. There was no takedowns on this fight. One attempt. Striking percentage for Parker was 67, 48% for Smith. Eventually, Parker was able to finish him off the ground after hitting him with a good shot, and that was the end of the fight after that. And then moving on to the other prelims, you had Drew Dober, who I mentioned earlier, got knocked out by Matt Pravola, and I think it was an early stoppage in a way that he protested, but then when you look at the highlight and the way that he got rocked with that hook, it was just undeniable. And then you had a submission win by Kennedy Nakachuko taking on Devin Clark with some sort of, I guess you could call that an anaconda standing choke or a guillotine choke on Devin Clark, and just finished him off right there. And then Caitlin Williams gets a decision over Rolando Beduo, and then you had Verna Genderoba getting a decision, just grinding and wrestling Marina Rodriguez all 3 rounds. And the way that she was able to utilize that thing that Khabib does, where he wraps both of your legs around in a figure 4 lock and just pushes you up against the cage, was really brilliant. Great wrestling on her part to grind out a decision win. Now, back to Aljamain Sterling and Henry Cejudo. Now, Henry Cejudo mentioned earlier tonight that he was going to retire from the sport. And you got to think to yourself, is he just saying that right now because of the fact that he lost and that it wasn't a decision that he wanted? Yes, that is true. But then I think as days go by, I think Henry Cejudo is going to look at this fight and say to himself, you know what? I made a great account of myself. And not only did I make a great account of myself, I think I won this fight, given that if it was a given different jurisdiction or some other different judges that were involved in the fight, perhaps maybe that he could have been able to get the win that he deserved, but he didn't. And that's just a matter of the different judges and the different subjective criteria that they were looking at. But nonetheless, this is why they say, you know, that you can't leave it in the hands of the judges. Just like Jan tonight, she was able to finish Jessica Andrade with the TKO knockout that she had, followed with an overhand right that she was able to hit her with and knock her out, and now becoming a number 1 contender. Right now, she moves up to number 5 position. She's currently number 6 in the women's strawweight division. Jessica Andrade is number 4, so you got to think this really moves her up maybe a little bit further than that, maybe perhaps number 3, but you never know, right? Because you got to wait until Tuesday when the rankings come in to see exactly how they're going to score this whole entire thing. Now, going back to Aljo, right? The underdog parlay that they had going on for Aljo, it was like 105 to defeat Henry Cejudo. And then you had Bilal Muhammad, who was, I think, the favorite going into this fight as well. Surprisingly, the favorite. Now, how about Bilal Muhammad being able to pull off Ramadan, right? And then being able to come into this fight winning the way that he did. Now, the way that Gilbert Burns looked, you got to say that, man, it was exactly the way that I had predicted it. It was like, I think the fight that he had with Jorge Masvidal, though it wasn't the most damaging fight in his career, it may have affected him in the way that he peaked. And a lot of people really don't take into consideration the level of peakness that you need before you go into a fight. You see, a lot of people just think that, like, you're in shape, you're ready, you can go in there and do the damn thing. It doesn't always work out like that, because you got to have months and weeks ahead of preparation in order for you to get in there and win your fights. Now, this is one of the things that I had mentioned and talked about with Dustin Akbari, who is the head grappling coach of Team Alpha Male. Now, Dustin Akbari told me back in the days that there is nothing like peaking when it comes to getting ready for fights. And by the way, Jan is a Team Alpha Male fighter, so that means that that's exactly how they got her ready for that fight against Andrade. One of the things that Dustin Akbari had told me is that without peaking, you're not going to go in there with the right motion in play. You're not going to have all your cylinders firing the way that they should. So this is why it's very important to go in there with the right peak methods and not just go in there and take the fight because you think that you have a great stylistic matchup to beat this guy. Now, on any given day, could Gilbert Burns absolutely beat Bilal Muhammad? Of course, it's the UFC. All these guys are top level and with some of the best guys in the world. And of course, they're going to be 50-50 with each other, right? At any given night. However, Bilal Muhammad, though also not the most ideal situation for him, maybe a couple of days a couple of weeks coming off of Ramadan, he was still training during Ramadan. You could say that during Ramadan, that was still a part of his training camp that he had going on. But nonetheless, Bilal Muhammad just had the right game plan along with the strategy and along with the right peaking time in order for him to win this fight tonight. And you could also argue that, you know what, it was very tumultuous considering the fact that he came in here with some kind of leg injury in the way that the announcers and commentators were hinting at during the fight. But he was able to come out strong. He was able to come out and implement his game plan and do exactly as he did. So let's just jump around these cards, right? How about Matt Pravola once again knocking out Drew Dober? Now, did I see this coming? No, absolutely not. I really thought Drew Dober was going to come out here winning because, I mean, if you look at Drew Dober, he's got great Muay Thai, great kicks, great boxing, and for him to get knocked out the way that he did, I just think that Matt Pravola just saw an opening there that Drew Dober would not have expected out of Matt Pravola. And once again, Matt Pravola is Ray Longo fighter with Matt Serra and Chris Weidman and Alec Quenta and Aljo and Marab. It's a great team that they got going on over there. So it's no wonder that the team came in here prepared and won their fights the way that they did. You got a finish from Matt. You got a championship win from Aljo. It was a great night of fights for Team Ray Longo overall. And let's see, what else can we talk about in this card? You had Bryce Mitchell was supposed to be in this card. Now, that would have been a fun one. Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush were supposed to be in this card. That would have been a fun one as well. So, what else is next for Aljamain Sterling after this? Obviously, they're going to have Sean O'Malley come up next after this fight. And then you have Henry Cejudo. What's next for him? He's probably going to go back to retirement. If not, maybe come back from some fun fights. Maybe try to go up to 145. Now, here's the thing that I wouldn't be surprised by, right? I would not be surprised if they gave Henry Cejudo a title shot against the 145 champion, whether that may be Yair Rodriguez or maybe that would be Volkanovski. Whoever that 145 champion may be, he's going to come back perhaps and fight one of those guys. as some sort of like celebrity fighter or big name super fight to come in. And of course, coming off of a loss, will they give him a title shot? Of course, it's a UFC. They've given Yoel Romero title shots coming off of losses. They've given title shots to Nick Diaz coming off of losses because GSP just wanted to fight him so bad. So make no mistake, that is what could possibly be next. Or maybe he could just go and fight one of these fun fights somewhere along the lines. Maybe fight the loser of Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley. Now, let's say Sean O'Malley was to lose that fight, gives a good account of himself. Boom, you got yourself a super fight at the 135 division right there with with Sean O'Malley taking on Henry Cejudo. Non-title fight, 5-round main event, somewhere along the lines. And that's what you have going on here. Look, this is what's great about the 135 division, right? It just seems like all these guys have already all fought each other. You had Aljo, who had fought the likes of Corey Sandhagen. Corey Sandhagen fought the likes of TJ Dillashaw. TJ Dillashaw fought the likes of Aljamain Sterling. Aljamain Sterling fought the likes of Peter Yan. Peter Yan fought the likes and legends such as Uriah Faber. And then you had situations where you have Sean O'Malley fighting Chito Vera, and then Chito Vera getting beat by none other than Corey Sandhagen. And then the list just goes on, right? So it's like 135 is this stacked division where a lot of these guys have already fought each other, but at the same time, it's also a division where there's a lot of unfinished business with different guys that have not fought each other yet, such as Merab and Aljamain Sterling not fighting each other yet because of the fact that they're teammates. And then Sean O'Malley, he's had some fights and some losses with some top names, but then comes back and defeats Peter Yan in their fight, only to come back and now get a title shot. And then here comes Henry Cejudo, who's supposed to be the lineal champion, has beaten the likes of Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz has beaten about almost everybody. And then all of a sudden loses to Aljamain Sterling tonight. I mean, that's the beauty of this sport, right? Whereas in boxing, I mean, what did you have in boxing? The only thing that you had was Ryan Garcia taking on Tank Davis, and that was literally the only aspect of competitive matchups they had going on. And of course, you have Devin Haney taking on Lomachenko in a couple of weeks at May 20th. But then you have Shakur Stevenson, who really hasn't fought anybody. And then you have, who else? Who else is in that position right now? Just a whole bunch of different names that nobody has really fought yet, or guys that have fought each other, or this and that. But hey, listen, you look at the 135 division in boxing in comparison to the 135 division in MMA. You got to think that it's just the nature of these two sports that you're going to have the MMA side have all the competitive fights, and then you have in the boxing side just very few and limited aspects of that reality. But slowly emerging, right? Because Theo Lopez has fought Lomachenko, which was great, but then Lomachenko has fought almost everybody, has lost early in his career because he wanted to move up rather quickly. And yeah, I think that's just kind of what you want. You want all these competitive fights, and I think you've already had a lot of competitive fights at the 135 division in the UFC, but I think you kind of want more, and then there's a lot more that, once again, I mentioned earlier, that's unsettled and unfinished. Now, with Canelo, what is next for him? He's talking about he wants to move up and fight Bivol for a rematch. In all honesty, this is probably not the best idea. In all honesty, it's really not. I mean, if you really think about it, he's already fought the guy. We already know what it is. We know what could happen. We know what can't happen. And we know that it's just a sheer size disadvantage. He's already undisputed at 168. Why does he need to go any further and try to humiliate himself from the past experience he had with Bivol? Why can't he just stay at 168 and give a chance to the likes of Demetrius Andrade? Why can't he do that? Why can't he go and fight the likes of David Benavidez, who a lot of people have been calling him to fight? Now, here's my hot take on Canelo is why he's not fighting these top 168 guys, but yet he wants to move up to 175. He goes and fights Kovalev. He goes and fights the likes of Bivol, but then he loses. And then you got to think to yourself, okay, well, what is his reason? Maybe it's because the higher the risk that he takes, perhaps maybe the better way that he looks for his brand, right? And what do I mean by that? Okay, well, if he loses to, let's say, David Benavidez or Demetrius Andrade at 168, it kind of looks bad on him if you really think about it, right? Well, why does it look bad on him? Well, because that's his division. It's his division, and he doesn't need to lose in a division that he's undisputed in. But guess what? If he goes and moves up to 175, he takes on a monster like Bivol. Okay, great. Nobody's going to really judge him for losing. It's almost like what McGregor calls the McGregor risk, right? Now, can we really blame McGregor for losing to Floyd Mayweather in a boxing match? Not really, because we've seen what happened afterwards. He got a Khabib fight, which eventually made him even more money, if not right around the equivalence of, or just maybe just a little bit under, but nonetheless, more money from the Floyd Mayweather fight, and then just a little bit more money from the Khabib fight. Why? Because he took a risk, and then after that, he took on Donald Cerrone, which made a lot of money also. I mean, not the most, because, you know, Donald Cerrone is not exactly the biggest name, but nonetheless, it's McGregor as a dance partner, so you're going to go and watch that. And then the two Dustin fights made the one of the top pay-per-view sellers in the entire company's history, because he takes risk. He takes risks that he doesn't have to. And I think that's where Canelo is sort of at. But if he was to start losing to guys at 168, I think that's where his stock really goes down. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people perceive him to avoid these fights, the likes of Andrade and all that. But then you look at the UFC side, man, nobody goes out and avoids anybody at all. Not unless if you're Khamzat Chimaev or Islam coming up, or maybe even Leon Edwards when he was on his way up. That's just the situation you had going on. People are just going to go and try to avoid you, right? But again, when you have the structure that you have in the UFC, it's less likely something like that is just going to happen. It's just not going to happen that way, because of the fact that the way that the company is structured, the way that they have their fighters set up with their pay, it's almost like you have to continuously fighting to make a good living. And in comparison to boxing, where you give these guys, $1 million for like one fight throughout the year, and you wonder why you don't see them for another year or 3 fights in a year. I mean, Canelo has done that. Let's not get it twisted. Canelo has fought multiple times in a year. And reason for that is because maybe he just wanted to, I guess, stay sharp, stay motivated, get a little bit more money, and not only that, just not lose that rust. Well, I think that in the next coming years that you're going to see in boxing, don't be surprised if you start seeing some upsets, because all these top boxers are not taking these fights, that are not going out there and pretty much going out there and taking these fights on a consistent basis. I think it's going to rust a lot of them to where they're going to take on these young and hungry upcomers and see the upsets, and as well as you should. This is exactly what you should be seeing out of MMA or boxing or all these combat sports. It's just only boxing where they have such a high protective mechanism to where you're just barely going to see any of these things go down. So, again, let's talk about Aljo winning. Is it good for business that Aljo won in comparison to Henry Cejudo? Well, let's suppose in an alternate universe, right, that Henry Cejudo was to win tonight. Now, what would have happened? Well, I think Henry Cejudo would have probably waited for quite a long time to come back and fight another fight in comparison to, let's say, Aljamain Sterling, who might possibly go and fight again in September. He's going to take the summer off, train for the summer, and come back in September and fight Sean O'Malley. Whereas if Henry was to go and win this fight, we may have never seen a Sean O'Malley title shot up until maybe November on a New York November card of the UFC that they do every year. That's the reality. Man, you know what? For all we know, Aljo would probably go out and defend his title in London in the next coming London card, and then they would probably have the force to make that into a pay-per-view somehow, if that was the case. I just think that Aljo would probably be more of an active champion in comparison to Henry Cejudo, because Henry Cejudo is just a little bit more of a celebrity fighter now, right? He's already won the gold medal. He's already become the double champ. He doesn't really have a lot to prove in comparison to Aljo, who just has this chip on his shoulder from the time when he won the fight against Peter Yan by disqualification, and even after the fact that he won it by decision afterwards. And now he's just getting all these fights where he's winning by decision, maybe not getting any finishes, which is probably going to create more chip on his shoulder and then something to prove in terms of his upcoming fights. So business-wise, it's probably a lot better for Aljo to be champion in comparison to Henry Cejudo. Now, what about Bilal Muhammad winning tonight? What does that prove? Well, that proves that you can really have a good training camp during Ramadan. Although it's hard, and I've tried it myself. You know, during Ramadan, I went and trained during the day when I was supposed to be, when I'm fasting. Right? While I'm fasting, I'm training during the day. So it's not really easy to do that, but at the same time, it does take your mind to different places. So you got to think,